5.18. I steal push bikes. It was during this space of time, before starting my new school, I met another lad called Ian Mottram. We encouraged each other to steal. And in fact, the first day that I went to school, I stole a bike to come home from school on. I eventually got a Francis Barnett 150cc motorbike, which my brother had stolen from Aylesbury College with some other lads. I kept this in the field on Bedgrove Estate, near our home. It was great fun to have a motorbike, and I would ride it across the fields to school and ride it home during my lunch hour. However, one day, someone stole my motorbike, and Ian Mottram informed me that he thought he knew the person that had taken it. So I went to this person's house early in one morning during my paper round and found a motorbike in his garage. It wasn't my bike, but I took it anyway. This ended up in me being charged with garage breaking and being put on a probation for 2 years.
I meet Mrs. Grace Knight. My teenage years. My first recollection of any person having any effect in my life was when I was about to leave school at the age of 15 years old. My mother had spoken to Mr. K.H. Knight, who was the proprietor of Central Bucks TV, and had arranged for me to have a part-time job working after school and on a Saturday. It was until I left school and I took up full-time work as an apprentice with Mr. Knight. I was told years later that my letter of job application was so badly written and the spelling so awful it was unintelligible and laughable. However, I was taken on despite my inability to write, spell and use correct grammar or read properly. This was during my last year at school. I first met Mrs. Grace Knight one Saturday morning whilst working with her husband. She was in hot pursuit of Ken, shouting at him for doing something that she disapproved of. I was in the workshop with Norman Garrett, the other apprentice, and I thought, wow, what an awful dragon of a woman, and pitied Mr. Knight from that moment on. Through Mr. Knight, I was introduced to radio and television servicing trade, and often went with him into customers' houses to repair television sets and install television aerials. I spent many hours with Ken, going into people's homes, and I soon learned that he was not faithful to his wife. Not that this bothered me. I knew what Grace was like from the first meeting. The idea of sexual promiscuity was very attractive to me. When we went out, enjoying ourselves, Mrs. Knight would be left at home, or in the workshop minding their 2 children, Alison and Mark. They also had a great big dog called Rufus, a red dog. By this time I had left school and was interested in our band. We wanted to make music. Ian Mayer was the bass player, and he built his own guitar amplifier from a circuit diagram that was published in the Practical Wireless. He built the amplifier and I helped him with the speaker cabinet, and we used this in all our future gigs. I soon began to realise the things I enjoyed were not the things Mrs. Knight approved of, or found interesting. I thought she was a right killjoy and was boring. She was a Christian, whatever that meant, and I soon realised her values was not the same as mine. What I considered good and enjoyable, she would call it sin and sinful. She would also complain to her husband that I was always with him and he gave her no time. It seemed she was often driven to despair by him never being in on time and being very unreliable. He often would leave her for hours whilst we were out working on jobs. On one occasion, Norman Garrett's mother, that's the other apprentice, complained to Mrs. Knight that Norman, her son, was not getting the training he needed because Ken was always taking me out with him. I heard this conversation over the shop's intercom. Mrs. Knight said yes, I was a nuisance, and she did not like me one bit, and it was not good that I should be out with her husband all the time. Upon hearing this, I felt angry and went downstairs to where they were and confronted them, saying I had heard what they'd said over the intercom. They were embarrassed, and I'm sure that didn't help our relationship. I really thought Mrs. Knight was an ogre. I began to attend Luton College of Technology to learn about radio and television servicing, and travelled by bus 1 day a week from Aylesbury to Luton. It was about an hour's run. I think it must have been due to Mrs. Knight and her religion that I began to notice the texts of Scripture put up outside churches as I passed by on the bus. They were called wayside pulpits. I began to memorise the verses such as, "Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people." And another, Jesus said, "If you find life difficult, learn of me, and the burden I shall give you will be not too difficult to carry." At that time I had no idea of the meaning of these texts of Scripture, but found it amusing to quote them to Mrs. Knight at any inappropriate moment in public, thinking it would embarrass her. On one occasion I remember being dressed in an old blanket made into an undercoat for my brother's mod anorak. I was standing on the corner of George Street, near the workshop in Aylesbury, one Saturday morning with Mr. and Mrs. Knight, and I quoted at the top of my voice with the two scriptures in order to embarrass Mrs. Knight. "Righteousness exalts a nation, sin is a reproach to any people," and Jesus says, "If you find life difficult, come unto me and learn of me, and I will give you rest." I'm not sure how they felt about it, but little did I know that one day I would learn the truths of these texts of Scripture and become a preacher of the gospel myself, and this quotation contained the essence of the gospel ministry. Mrs. Grace Knight became a great help to me, and lived till 2001 when she died. Here is the link to videos of her funeral and obituaries for Mrs. Grace Maud Knight. I enjoyed working with Mr. Knight because he seemed to appreciate the help and abilities I had, and would trust me to drive the van at 15 years old. On one occasion he was short of a driver, and had no one to deliver a television set, so he dressed me up in a large sheepskin coat, gave me a pair of dark glasses to wear, instructed me to deliver the TV set to a house in Quarrendon Estate. I was very pleased to do this, even more when it turned out that the house where I was delivering the TV set was where my friend Gillespie lived. On another occasion I was given the job of replacing a complete IF board on a new Ferguson 850 TV receiver in the customer's home. A qualified engineer would do this normally in a workshop, would not have done it in the home, but this unconventional method approach was normal to me. Mr. Knight had complete confidence in me at the age of 15 to do the job. I'm sure the customers were not at all happy at this 15-year-old repairing their lovely brand new television receiver. During this time I was still making music in the group, and when I was 16 Mr. Knight's business failed and we went into liquidation, so I found myself another job. I got an apprenticeship with Sale & Mellor, a radio and TV shop in Aylesbury. I worked there until I got in trouble with the police when I was sacked at the age of 17.